reading comes from today from Haggai 2. In the second year of the king of Darius, on the 21st day of the 7th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet of Haggai. Speak to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, to Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest, and to the remnant of the people. Ask them, who of you is left who saw the house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it not seem to you like nothing? But now be strong, Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. Be strong, all of you people of the land, declares the Lord, and work. For I am with you, declares the Lord Almighty. This is what I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt, and my spirit remains strong. Do not fear. This is what the Lord Almighty says. In a little while, I will once more shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. I will shake all nations, and what is desired by all nations will come. And I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord Almighty. The silver is mine and the gold is mine, declares the Lord Almighty. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty. And in this place I will grant peace, declares the Lord Almighty. On the 24th day of the 9th month, in the second year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Haggai. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Ask the priest what the law says. If someone carries consecrated meat in the fold of their garment, and that fold touches some bread or stew, some wine, olive oil or other food, does it become consecrated? The priest answered, no. Then Haggai said, if a person defiled by contact with a dead body touches one of these things, does it become defiled? Yes, the priest replied, it becomes defiled. Then Haggai said, so it is with this people and this nation in my sight, declares the Lord. Whatever they do and whatever they offer, there is defiled. Now give careful thought to this from the day on. Consider how things were before one stone was laid on another in the Lord's temple. When anyone came to a heap of 20 measures, there were only 10. When anyone went to a wine vat to draw 50 measures, there was only 20. I struck all the work of your hands with blight, mildew and hail, yet you did not return to me, declares the Lord. From this day on, from the 24th day of the 9th month, give careful thought to the day when the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid. Give careful thought. Is there yet any seed left in the barn? Until now, the vine and the fig tree, the pomegranate and the olive tree had not borne fruit. From this day on, I will bless you. The word of the Lord came to Haggai a second time on the 24th day of the month. Tell Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, that I am going to shake the heavens and the earth. I will overturn royal thrones and shatter the power of the foreign kingdoms. I will overthrow chariots and their drivers. Horses and their riders will fall, each by the sword of his brother. On that day, declares the Lord Almighty, I will take you, my servant Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, declares the Lord, and I will make you my signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares the Lord Almighty.
Well, this morning we both continue and we also finish our 2-week holiday series looking at the book of Haggai. Last week, we looked at how Haggai was a prophet who was speaking to the Jews who had returned from exile in Babylon and were now rebuilding their city and their society, which had been destroyed decades earlier. And what we looked at in this was how God had brought about what was a massive shift in the power situation in this part of the world, which ultimately resulted in the Persian king Cyrus conquering that former empire now of Babylon and allowing the Jews to go home and to rebuild not only their city, but even telling them that they need to go back and rebuild the temple as well. That this foreign king actually claimed that God had given him the responsibility and the directive to make this happen, and that God's people, they now had this need to return to worshiping him and to actually be a light to the rest of the world. They needed to go back to Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, which had been destroyed by the Babylonians, and they had to return to worshiping God and doing it faithfully. Now, unfortunately, what we saw happen instead was that despite all that God had done in order to bring this all about, and how he had been steering everything, even world politics, towards helping them to carry out this task, well, we saw in the end, the people didn't actually rebuild the temple. Instead, they just went back to basically making the same mistakes that their ancestors did. They just went back to only looking at themselves, just living their own lives, and forgetting all that God had done, as they weren't really putting their hope in him or looking to worship him or to make him their priority in their life. God was very much at this point still a distant second in what was the list of what was important to these Jews who had returned home and who had been allowed to rebuild the temple, hence why they spent that 18 years avoiding this responsibility to rebuild and kept avoiding it until Haggai was sent to them in order to basically just wake them up. That Haggai's job was now to tell the people that the reason that they're struggling, like the reason why they don't have rain and everything that they do is failing, why they're not getting a good return on this farming that they're doing. Well, it's all because God's not blessing them. And until they come back and worship and trust in him, that is not going to happen. Things aren't going to change. And this is because they can't go it alone. The land itself, that does not bless them, but God blesses them by giving them this land and making this land work for them, really in a supernatural way. So unless he becomes their priority again, they're just going to end up like their ancestors, where they're going to have no hope and there's just going to be no return on their labor. So what we saw last week as we started this book was how God had to be their priority going forward. They now had to focus on him. And we also looked at how likewise God has to be the priority for us today as well, as we also cannot ignore God in our day-to-day life. We cannot just call ourselves followers of him and then yet live in a way that ignores him, just like these Jews were doing. But instead, he's got to be the center of our life. We are now to live for him, and we must continue to come together to worship him. That's what it means to be a follower of God. We all come together, and together we worship him. But today, as we now look at chapter 2, we see that because of what Haggai said to them, the Jews actually have been rebuilding the temple. That there's warning, this rebuke that was given to them to wake them up. Well, it actually has done that. So now they're back to actually putting God as their priority, which means this passage now turns from being really a warning to now being an encouragement to keep hold of God and to keep hold of his promises, and that God will bless them and that he has a plan for the future and that he will bring it about. So they need to not lose faith, but they've just got to continue to put their hope in him. And that even when things may seem hopeless, and even if the temple is really only a shadow of its former glory, well, God is every bit as present as he's always with his people. And just as he is today with those who have their trust and hope in him and his promises. That's the big message coming out of this. God is with his people, and you can trust in his promises. So looking at the actual passage now, as we finish this book, we see this chapter starts off really not long after the first chapter ended. In fact, it's actually barely a month later, as chapter 1 ends speaking of the 24th day of the 6th month. And then in verse 1 here, which is also the very end of verse 15 of chapter 1, there's sort of this weird chapter division going on in this book where they chose to split it. But basically, verse 15b, we'll call it, of chapter 1, as well as verse 1 of chapter 2 reads, "In the second year of King Darius, On the 21st day of the 7th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. So this is not a long time later, which means really not a lot has happened since the end of the last chapter where they just started rebuilding the temple. But with this rebuilding now underway, well, God now gives Haggai something important that he wants to convey to his people. As God tells Haggai in verse 2 to go to the leaders and he's to ask them a question. And then in verse 3, we actually see what this question is. It says, who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it not seem to you like nothing? And what God wants them to acknowledge is that, yes, the current temple that is being rebuilt and how it stands at that point in time, a month into rebuilding, it's not impressive. That it really has fallen a long way from the way it was before their exile to Babylon, when we read about how Solomon brought gold and stone and the best timber in order to make something that really showed and it symbolized God's power and glory. That it was a building like no other, but it actually took over 100,000 men over 7 years to make. And it would impress anyone who saw it. And yet this new one is obviously nothing like that at all. There's no denying that whilst they're finally building it, which is a good thing, but it's only a shadow of its former self. And there are possibly older people there who are looking at this new one, who would have grown up hearing all the stories of the glorious old one, or maybe even depending on their age, maybe even have childhood memories of it. And they're now looking on this one that they're building with what is just pessimistic disappointment. That this new one, it's such a drop in quality that even with this renewed effort to now remake it, well, it's never going to be as extraordinary as the original. But this is where we get what is God's first promise. We're going to see several promises in this passage this morning, and this is going to be the first one. Because having pointed out this obvious issue of how the old one was far more glamorous and that this one's really just like a cheap imitation, right? It's a knockoff of what the original one was. Now that God's acknowledged that, Haggai is to say to the people in verses 4 and 5, but now be strong, Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord, and work. For I am with you, declares the Lord Almighty. This is what I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt, and my spirit remains among you. Do not fear. So God's promises here is to be with the people and to give them strength to rebuild the temple, and that they must not give up just because it all looks so hopeless. That whilst the temple they're making, it may not look impressive, well, they always have to remember that God will be with them as he has always been with them right from the time that he led them out of Egypt. And he promised and made a covenant with them all the way back then at the Exodus to always be with them. And now they've just got to believe that. They need to trust in him. Not worry about what the new temple looks like in comparison to the old one, as appearances are not what matters, as God is no less with them, despite this one being of what is an obvious lower standard. Now, at first, that almost might seem like a bit of a contradiction to what was said in last week's passage, where in verse 4 of chapter 1, God asked them, is it time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? So this promise, on the surface, it may seem to go against that issue raised before. As now he's saying, but it doesn't really matter what the temple looks like. Its build quality is irrelevant. He doesn't actually care, but he seemed to care last passage. And why this is not a contradiction is because in chapter 1, he was simply saying, just get your priorities straight. Fix up the temple first, then fix up your houses. and don't leave my house a ruin while you're focusing on yourself. Where now he's saying, since you are building it, and since you are putting me first again, well, even if this rebuilt temple doesn't impress like the original one did, well, as long as they have their priorities straight, as long as they're being faithful, then that doesn't really matter, right? He's going to be with them anyway, as he always has. And it doesn't matter if this one doesn't shine as brightly as the old one. Which means that when they finish building it, it may not look like much, but the building is not important as he is no less with them. That even if the temple is no longer an impressive monument to the power of the nation of Israel, it doesn't mean that they're not blessed by God. That's because God's relationship with them, it actually goes beyond just the building. He's always been with them since the time that they were in Egypt, and that is what matters. The issue was the fact that they weren't even trying to rebuild it. Not the quality of it, the fact that he just didn't matter to them. And in fact, we can actually see why he now makes this point. Because when the old temple stood there with all its gold and its valuable materials, that is when the nation of Israel was defeated and carted off into exile as they'd become corrupt and they'd lost all faith. So even in their very recent history, they already know from experience where an impressive building that is devoid of faith leads them to, right? It leads them from being very far from God and out of his blessing as people who do not know the ways of the Lord. Even when the temple was at its best, that didn't really matter once they had lost faith. Which is why here God is saying, if you can remember how impressive that building was and then see how basic this one is, don't worry. That's not important because he's promising to be there with them despite the building's condition. The quality of the structure is not what matters. It's only their faith that does. And this is, I think, a very important point. This point of not losing sight of God's promises and his everlasting presence, because it's one that actually is often forgotten. It's one being forgotten by many Christians right now today as churches shrink in Western countries and they've no longer got the glamour in society that they once had. So when we look at Europe, we see impressive churches with big steeples and the most elaborate carvings, buildings that can fit thousands of people. And they were themselves works of art, hence why today they're some of the most popular tourist sites in Western cities. But of course, we know that these same churches were often devoid of anything to do with God, as they'd stopped focusing on him years ago, even centuries ago, despite what is their impressive architecture. So you might look at a church today, meeting in a warehouse or in an old shed, which is often where a lot of churches today do meet. And you might think, well, you know, how disappointing, right? How lacking in presence compared to those great cathedrals of the past. But then when we understand what is happening here with the temple, we can know that a church of 10 faithful people who genuinely worship the Lord is in fact better than one of thousands of people meeting in an impressive structure that have no idea of God and his ways. That the point here is that God is with his people, irrespective of what the building looks like. And the problem raised before was their attitude in not even trying to remake the temple. And it wasn't regarding the quality of the building itself once they got going. And it's also for this basic reason that today, some of the largest churches with the most impressive facilities and the ones that have vast resources, but they're also at times the farthest from God in what they teach and how people within the church conduct themselves. And that is simply because the link between the faithfulness of the people and the true quality of the church that shows God at work. This is never about the outward appearance. It's all that glamour. It really means nothing. That doesn't represent the faithfulness of the people inside. So God will be present with his people wherever they are, as worship comes from the heart and it's not this physical spectacle. And that's what they needed to come to understand. Temple may not look that impressive. Doesn't matter. God is with them no less. But after stating that they need to not be depressed about the quality of the new building when compared to the original, well, after this point, we now move on to what is the bigger promise. The promise of what God will do in the future, showing that whilst their head may still be stuck in the past, dwelling on the old temple, God's plans are moving forward, so that is where they need to set their minds. So we see in verses 6 to 9, a list of huge statements about what God has in store for the entire world. He says in verse 6 that he will shake the heavens and the earth. In verse 7, he will shake the nations and says that what is desired by all nations will come. So a clear indicator of the Gentiles looking for and coming to be with God's people once the Messiah arrives. And then in 8 and 9, he speaks of everything being restored and that the glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house. And in this place, I will grant peace. So God assures the people that what he has in store for the future is actually greater than what it is that they keep looking back towards. That what they have here is really the rose-tinted glasses problem, that everything was better back then. And now they're seeing, therefore, the present and especially the future as being bleak. And what God is saying is the best is actually yet to come. That there are better days ahead for his people. That the temple, yes, it was once a great building for the kingdom of Israel, despite their lack of faith. But now he's promising, he's saying in the future, he plans on bringing a blessing to what is the entire world. And when that time arrives, it will be better for everyone, including them. They're going to be caught up in this great day that God has planned for the world. So the promise is there is so much to look forward to, and they've got to keep their eyes on that. He's given them what is a glimpse of the future, and they need to not keep looking back, thinking about all it is that they've lost. And likewise for us today, the same message needs to be understood, because it's easy to be in a church in Australia or another Western country today, the countries that had those great cathedrals, and be in a church that is shrinking and then being depressed about it. Remembering the better days when there were more people and there was more happening. But then when we look forward to God's promises and know what it is that we're actually heading towards and what our hope is in, then we know that the better days are actually ahead. The church is not just about this world, but it is building towards the next one. So there is no need to keep looking back, thinking of the good old days and then comparing now to back then, as the big promise of the Bible is that the best days yet to come, that God has a plan and it will be finished. So keep looking forward to that. So it's an important lesson for us to know now, and it was likewise something that they really needed to know at this point of time as they were rebuilding this temple. Because this pessimism in their outlook is what stopped them from rebuilding the temple to begin with. And now that they've started, they're now seeing it as lacking. It's disappointing them. They keep remembering when the temple had all this gold and it was a marvel that impressed all travelers. They look back at better days instead of looking forward to what God has in store and what he's actually promised them. So God's message and guarantee to them now is, I am with you and I have big plans for the entire world. And it's that which matters. The plans for the future is what matters, and not the quality of this current building. What he's got in store for the world will be more magnificent than the original temple at its very best. So that's what they've got to keep their focus on, looking ahead. So whilst the first promise was looking at the present and reminding them of how he is with them, just as he has always been with them, but this promise to them now is that he has a plan, and the end result of it will be greater than anything seen in the world today. that God's people do have better days ahead, and they need to not dwell on the past, but know that they're actually part of building towards something fantastic which is coming in the future. But now we jump to the third promise, a third revelation that Haggai has to give, as God wants his people to understand something very important. He's so far helped them to see that he's with them, irrespective of what the temple is like compared to the old one. And he's also made it clear that in the future, he will make things greater than what they've ever been. So stop looking back and look forwards to that. But there's another thing here for them to learn that helps to better understand the lessons given earlier in chapter 1 and what has enabled them to come back in relationship with God once more. Why it is that they now have these first two promises to begin with. So we see it says here in verse 10, on the 24th day of the 9th month, in the 2nd year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Haggai. So we've now jumped another couple of months again. We can expect that even more work has been done on the temple, and the nation as a whole would be growing in positivity and hope since those last promises were given. But we've seen verses 11 and 12 that this curious question gets asked. If someone carries consecrated meat in the fold of their garment, and that fold touches some bread or stew, some wine, olive oil, or other food, does it become consecrated? So that's the question put to them. Does this consecration pass to other things? And we see here that the priest answered no. And the point here is that when something is consecrated, it's been set aside to God. But it does not pass this specialness on to everything else. That the holiness of it cannot transfer from one thing to the next, as in just because something touched this thing that has touched this other thing that has touched this holy object at some point does not cause the holiness to then pass through all these other things. That you cannot get a never-ending line of consecrated objects just because different things keep coming into contact with other stuff that has touched the first consecrated piece of meat at some point in the past. But then in contrast to this, he asks this other question. If a person defiled by contact with a dead body touches one of these things, does it become defiled? And we see the answer of the priest given is that yes, it becomes defiled. So now we actually have what is the opposite thing happening. If something defiled touches that which is not, and then that thing touches something else, well, it also becomes defiled. And on the surface, that may seem almost contradictory. Holiness does not pass on, yet defilement does. And the question is why? Why the difference in these two, what seemingly is very similar situations? But to help understand it, since we are talking about consecrated meat, then think of it like meat. If fresh meat touches off meat, the off meat doesn't suddenly become fresh. The freshness obviously doesn't get passed on. But instead, the off meat touching the fresh meat now means that the fresh meat has been contaminated and is not fit to eat. And if this contaminated meat then was to touch other meat, then you pass the bacteria along. It only goes one way. And you can easily see how this same thing applies to other situations. For example, if you pour clean, clear water into sewage, it doesn't purify it. But if you put sewage into fresh water, well, that then contaminates it. And whatever water that then gets poured into, well, that also gets contaminated as well. It passes along. So it's a one-way process. Dirty things make clean things dirty, but clean things do not make dirty things clean. The passing on, it only goes in one direction. Like a virus, the sick make the healthy sick, whereas the healthy person doesn't take the sick person's virus away just by being with them, just by touching. That in all these things, it only works one way. Contamination passes on, not consecration. which is what Haggai now says here, as he now compares the people to this issue of being defiled. He says, so it is with this people and this nation in my sight, declares the Lord. Whatever they do and whatever they offer there is defiled. So because of the sin of the people, their defilement doesn't just disappear with their acts of worship. That showing up at the temple, going to the altar, it actually doesn't take that sin away. But instead, because of their sin, they just defile it all. That their offerings have become worthless as they cannot be given correctly because their sin, it now defiles everything that they do. So they can't really get out of this situation. Their sin, their reason for the exile, the fact that they left the temple in ruins for 18 years, that history can't just suddenly be undone. And whatever sacrifice they make is itself now defiled. So like a person today who has lived in sin and they've walked very far from God's ways, well, what can such a person do to make themselves right? Right? How can they take their own sin away? And whatever they do to try and make themselves right, this will still be done from the sin in the heart, and the history of sin can't just disappear. They can't fix themselves. And likewise, what the Jews have done defiles them, and simply offering sacrifices now at the altar does not make them clean, but instead it just makes their offering defiled. They cannot undo the damage because just like off meat, they cannot make themselves fresh again, and everything it touches and everything they touch, well, that now goes off. It too is now defiled. Hence both now the warning given here, as well as what is the hope offered to actually get them out of this mess. So as we read on, we first see the warning given, which is almost the exact same thing as said in chapter 1, now being repeated, as it's pointed out to them that due to their own sins, they are facing the consequences of those sins. So he says now in verse 15, now give careful thought to this from this day on. Consider how things were before one stone was laid on another in the Lord's temple. And then as we read on in verses 16 to 19, we see the same issues of how their labor was in vain and everything they did failed as God withheld his blessing from them. That they didn't get the rain and their crops were hit with hail, as this was a judgment on them due to their sin and God's not coming to their rescue. So what he's saying here is, you've seen what your sin has resulted in, and this is why you have been struggling. This is where your issues come from. Is that the fact that everything you touch is defiled and the plants do not give you a harvest. Now, simply coming into the temple, it's not going to remove this from them, as that history. All these times they've done their own thing and neglected God. Well, that cannot be erased. They are now defiled as people. And therefore, whatever they offer in sacrifice, it's simply worthless. There's almost of no point in doing it. But then he also says in verse 19, the important thing, the hope now offered, and the third promise given here. Because he then says, from this day on, I will bless you. So at this point, this blessing that's being promised, it's only by grace, and it's not by their actions. The fact that they've now just started to rebuild the temple, and they're now starting to finally prioritize God, well, that does not itself suddenly now make them clean. Their obedience, of course, does lead to God blessing them. That's what he asked them to do, to now prioritize him. But the blessing's not being earned, as it's been gracefully given, right? It's always a gift, and it's one withheld from those who are defiled and who show no repentance. So just like how if someone today did spend their entire life living in the sins of this world without guilt, they'll not suddenly be all right just because they decided to stop doing the wrong thing. But just now doing the right thing doesn't erase their sins or make up for all the wrong that they'd done beforehand. But turning to God in forgiveness Well, this will lead to the same grace being given and their sin being taken away, not as a reward, but likewise by the grace of God. It's a gift that comes from him. Doesn't have to give it, but he will give it to those who repent and then prioritize him. So the only way to be made right, the only way for sin to be taken away is by God's grace. It's not a sudden change of heart by oneself, but it's the sin being taken by God and then what is a new heart being given. It's God deciding in grace to bless, and it's not something that can be obtained or fixed by oneself. And that's what God is saying to them here. He's warned them, he's pointed out to them that all that they do, it's defiled, so they cannot offer a sacrifice which to him is of any worth. But now he's saying, despite that, he's saying, I will bless you anyway. The promise is that they can now be accepted and they can have their hope restored as God is restoring them. Which is why as we finish the chapter, we see a similar promise being given as to what we saw before. The promise of what is a better future where God will bring peace to a fallen world and his glory, it is going to be revealed to all. So God says once again in verse 22, I will overturn royal thrones and shatter the power of the foreign kingdoms. See, everything keeps pointing towards this better day. They keep looking backwards. They look back at what they've lost and keep looking at what they have now got as being inferior and inadequate to what they once had. But God's big promise is that he'll bring a day when he brings blessing to the entire world, and he's saying to them, prioritize him and trust in his promises as you now live today in hope of that future. Because that better day that he's talking about, it's obviously for them as well. They need to keep trusting in his promises and not keep neglecting him or dwelling on what were the things of this world that they feel that they've lost. So to sum up both today, as well as Haggai as a whole, as it's only these two chapters, the overall message of Haggai is to emphasize the importance of obedience to God's commands, prioritizing him as we saw last week, and to trust in the promise that he gives of blessing and grace to those who do prioritize him, to those who obey him. That we're living today in hope of the future that God has promised. So we need to keep that. That is our priority, even when we might be getting tired or maybe distracted by the troubles of this world. And that we're not to have, therefore, what is a defeatist attitude, where we look around in a country like Australia, and we might wonder, where is God? Why do things look so bleak for the church? And thinking that because churches today are, unfortunately, small, and many, even like ours, have shrunk over time. And therefore, it becomes very easy to get negative and to maybe even stop trying. To wonder and to ask ourselves, what is the point of even inviting someone to church? Right? Why in our current culture even tell anyone about Jesus? Because even if we do, they'll probably just find the gospel stupid and they'll not believe it anyway. That's the state of Australia today. Why do we even keep trying? But giving up, having that negative view of the world, well, that's what the Jews here did. Right? They figured, why even build a temple? It surely doesn't matter now anyway, because look how bad everything currently is compared to the past, compared to what was our best days. What they needed was a reminder that God is no less with them. So they need to keep pushing, and they need to keep trusting, keep looking forward and hoping in all that God has promised of what is a better day. The best day is still in the future. And it's the same message for us now. The message is keep trusting in God and keep proclaiming the gospel. If we truly believe Christ will return and that the best days when he returns are ahead, then we won't look at the sorry state of Western culture and the size of churches in the West and Australia today and then just give up. Instead, we'll keep pushing. And we'll see the word said here in the first paragraph has actually been applicable to us as well. Because God said to them here at the start, in those first few verses, he says things like, be strong, over and over again. He says, for I am with you. And he finishes that paragraph saying, do not fear. And we need to believe that today as well. That is God's message to his people then, and it's the same message for his people all through history. Keep pushing, no matter how things may look, because we know he'll keep his promises, and what he's promised in the future is where our best days are.